Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the Alfa Romeo Driver Podcast, brought to you by the Alfa Romeo Owners Club. I'm Guy Swarbrick, and this afternoon I'm joined by board member Jonathan Griffin for what will be the first of a two-part episode, talking about cars he's owned and cars he's raced, about the recent Southern Alfa Day, and about his role on the board helping Grant Richardson with section development. We've got a lot to cover, so we won't waste any more time. Good afternoon, Jonathan.
Hello, Guy.
Anybody who's met you will be in no doubt about your passion for Alfa Romeo, but when did all of that start?
My first exposure to an Alfa was when I was very small in the late 60s, when my uncle got a new red car. And I have only the vaguest memory of it, but it was a brand new GT 1300 Junior. And he was a young doctor at the time, and the number plate was DOC 99. And so it was exactly the sort of car a rakish young doctor would like to have, I guess, in about 1960.
With a sideline in ice cream cones.
Exactly. Well, no, but if you remember back to when you were small, you go to the doctors and the doctor would say, right, open wide, stick your tongue out and say 99. Well, they looked down your throat and tried to see if there was anything up with your tonsils. That was my starting point with Alfa.
And how long was it between then and actually owning one?
It was quite a while. My dad, although my dad liked cars, he had company cars. He never had a second car except a Morris Minor for my mum. And my appreciation of cars back when I was quite young was limited to the Triumph Spitfire. I thought was marvellous because I thought there was an obvious synergy between the car and the fighter plane of the Second World War, which, you know, again in the 60s, it was only sort of 20 years and a bit past the end of the war, and people bought cartoons, children's cartoons stacked full of war cartoon strips. It was all over the place, that sort of stuff. I thought the Spitfire was great. It had to be fantastic. The other car that was interesting to me at the time was actually the Piper, which is quite a short-run sports car, but it was built in Wokingham, where I grew up, and I used to see them driving around locally. They were literally made about a quarter of a mile away from where I lived at the time. But as far as Alfas are concerned, yes, I occasionally noticed an Alfa growing up, but it wasn't until my brother Gavin, my stepbrother Gavin, was 17 that things changed. His father was a great car enthusiast and had a lot of sports cars, and very indulgently bought his son a car for his 17th birthday. I'm sure it turned up on his 17th birthday, and it was a red Alfasud 1.3 Ti S-Reg. And that was fantastic. The noise, the crackling exhaust note, and then the driving experience. Gavin is a very good driver, and although he was young, he passed his test very early and acquired this Sud, and used to just race around the roads in it. It was a very exhilarating car. But it didn't last very long for various reasons. And I'd had my interest in Alfas peaked, but he replaced it with the most fantastic car, which was a 1967 or 8 Giulia Sprint GTV. So he had this car at the age of 17. He asked me if I would go down and have a look at it with him, and it was for sale in Hayling Island. So yep, we jumped in the car, drove down to Hayling Island and found the guy who was selling it. And it turned out to be a man called Ralph Lederman, who had raced an Alfetta GTV Turbo in the Alfa Romeo Owners Club Championship. So not only did we go down and see this lovely old Sprint GTV, but we were introduced to this guy who was totally immersed in the racing of old Alfas. And so we spent quite a long time talking to him. And Gavin couldn't resist the Sprint GTV, which was bluette with a lovely tan interior. So we drove back in convoy after the money had been handed over, and Ralph threw in some spares as well. So there were a couple of spare cylinder heads and all sorts of other bits and bobs which came with the car. And that was really, although I'd known about the 105 series cars, it was really the start of my sort of modest obsession with that series of cars, with the lovely designs, the fantastic cleanliness of the engine bay, the interesting handling, and just the fun of owning them. It was good, and it wasn't long before I acquired one myself.
We'll come back to your racing career later on, but it sounds as though Ralph had quite a lot to answer for, really.
Yes, he did. I mean, Ralph, as is so often with people who race cars, they're often quite modest actually about it all. They sort of take it in their stride, but you could see that it was a complete and utter obsession with him. He had a great big storage shed racked up with spares for various cars, and the way he spoke about the racing was designed to encourage young chaps to, yes, take more interest and hopefully join in.
So Gavin's now got his 105. How long was it before you followed suit?
He had that when he was 17. So that was in about, let me think, 76, that was about in about 80, I suppose that was about 84. And then in 85, he bought a 1750 GTV in Chiswick. And later in 85, I bought one as well. So we both had 1750 GTV Mark IIs. And mine was quite a late one. It was an L-Reg, red 1750 GTV Mark II with a black interior. And I drove down to Boscombe near Bournemouth to view it. And of course, if you remember back in the day before the internet, if you wanted a car, you would be down to the newsagent to buy Auto Trader or Southern Auto Trader or the Free Ad paper or whatever it was at the time, or Loot, Exchange and Mart, and you'd be thumbing through all those small ads, running your fingers down the A's, looking for the Alfas, and of course there were all sorts of quite exotic ones for sale back in the 80s. And so a 1750 GTV advertised for, I think it was about 675 quid. I thought, yes, sounds good. I rang the guy, and although he had an English name, he spoke with an Italian accent. So I thought, maybe this car was going to be good. I drove down to Boscombe and looked at it, and it was great. It was sat there alongside a couple of other 105 series cars, and he took me out for a drive in it, and it sounded good, seemed to go well, and the deal was done. I think I ended up paying £600 for it and drove it back. And of course, as is always the way with old cars, the heart rules the head sometimes, doesn't it? And on a test drive, it's not always immediately apparent that there are things that aren't quite as they should be. So the first thing I noticed on the way home was that the handbrake didn't really hold. Put it up 3 notches, nothing's happening. Put it up another couple, there's just a slight amount of grip, but nothing much. And then there was a vibration from the prop shaft. But I sorted some of those things out and had a lot of fun in it. But I'd always wondered why the boot was painted with thick black paint inside. And one day I was looking inside, I could see an edge. So I got a screwdriver and I sort of picked away at this edge, and I levered it, and it pinged up, and I grabbed hold of it and pulled up a strip that had been plastered down on the boot floor. When I turned it over, it said Smedley's Garden Peas, and someone had gone to a great deal of trouble. Instead of welding a small patch on some holes in the boot floor, which would have taken not a lot of time, they'd intricately cut the Smedley's pea tin to the shape that was required, and then resined it down and then painted over it, sort of fillering the edges so it didn't look very obvious. So that was another lesson in using a magnet and tapping things and looking carefully when you buy an old car. But yes, that was my first Alfa, a 1750 GTV Mark II, and I had it as my everyday car for a time. Used to drive to work in it. I remember going down to Castle Combe to watch the Alfa Romeo Owners Club Championship there in it with a couple of friends, and it was a fantastic introduction to running an Alfa.
And the first of how many 105s that you've had now, excluding race cars?
Quite a few. I haven't totted them up for you in advance, but I had, yes, I think I got the GTV through one MOT before it got, it donated its best bits to some other cars, shall we say. I had a 1750 Berliner in about 1987-88, which was a very interesting car. It performed well. It had lots of space, it was comfortable, and I really liked it. But because, when you own a car, you often notice other cars of the same model. And I joined the Alfa Club, I think it was late 85, and I thought it would be marvellous to go along to one of the club test days. So they would run test days at places like North Weald Aerodrome. You could turn up and go around the cones, and you got timed, so it was all a bit of fun. And one of the guys doing that was also in a Berliner, and his name was Chris Taylor. And Chris drove his Berliner on the road, but he put a cage in it, or he had a cage in it, and he also raced it at the weekend. And I thought this was absolutely marvellous. And I thought, I will have a plan to do the same thing. I just had this idea of following Chris out onto the track and as sort of dicing through Paddock Hill Bend at Brands or whatever. The Berliner wasn't the best auto test machine. The solid axle and the handbrake on the back in a long, heavy car didn't make it as agile as some of the others, but it was still good fun. But yeah, that was the only Berliner I've ever had. I took it to a guy with the idea of getting it race prepared, and he put it up in the air. And he looked at it all over, and he got his little hammer out and started tapping the sills. And I could see he was sucking his teeth. And he said to me, "Well, do you know what?" He said, "If you were going to race this," he said, "I'd replace the sills. If I was racing this, I think that's what you should do." So, of course, I asked him how much it would be. And then I sucked my teeth when he told me. I was a bit crestfallen. I wasn't sure what to do. But he said, "Well, as it happens, I've got a Julia Super rolling shell over there, which just needs an engine and gearbox. And that could come your way if you were interested." Oh, I know that's slightly diverting away from the ownership question, and maybe we should come to that later. But that was how I acquired my Julia Super.
Presumably for less than the cost of replacing 2 sills.
For not much more, actually. For not much more. Because at the time, the Alfa panels, if you were going to use genuine Alfa panels, they were quite hard to come by. And we're talking 30 years ago. And there were really no repro panels of quality. They were just bent bits of metal that people had to do a lot of fettling to get to fit. So, and he knew that. He knew that it would be quite a lot of work to do the job properly. So I thought about it for not that long. And in the end, I actually donated the Berliner to Chris Taylor as a spare. So he had a whole load of spare doors and panels and things. And I bought the Julia Super and subsequently had it turned into a race car, which was great.
As I said, let's come back to the racing. So, what came after the
Berliner? Well, the Berliner. What actually happened was that I had a number of Alfas. So after the 1750 GTV, I had a 1.2 Ti Sud. Which I loved. I bought it. I think I was the second owner from new, and the original owner was a dentist in Reading, about a mile from where I lived. And I picked it up. I think he'd had about 95% of the use of the car, and I got the remaining 5% because you could buy Alfasuds very cheaply back in the mid late 80s. I think I paid about £195 for it with an MOT, quite a long MOT. But coming towards the end of that MOT period, and having run it through the winter, I could see that there was maybe a little bit more fresh air around the bottoms of the front wings than really there should be. And it did go to the scrapyard. Sadly, I mean, nowadays, of course, you'd pull your hair out having to scrap a Sud that could be rescued with a bit of welding. But then it was just another old car. And of course, as the numbers reduce, they become much more cherished. The remaining ones become much more cherished. So I had the 1.2 Ti, and I followed that with a blue 1.3 Ti, the 1286cc version, which was a lovely zippy engine. Not many more brake horsepower on paper, but it felt as though it had much more go. It was much more of a sort of racing machine, in inverted commas. And I went on holiday with friends to Yorkshire with that, and filled it up with rucksacks. We went hiking. It did some good work. And again, it was another one that was a young man's car. You buy it cheap, and you know that it's not going to last you more than a year or two at the most. So when that came up for MOT renewal and looked like it was going to need a load of work, I sold it to someone I knew by the name of Jamie Porter of the Alfa Workshop. I mean, this is years ago. This is back in the 80s. And Jamie at the time was working on cars, hadn't set up the Alfa Workshop, but it was no surprise when he finally did. And that car, he turned into a bimotore and put 2 engine. And apparently it went very well. But what became of it after that, I've no idea. The last Sud I had was probably the lowest mileage Alfa I've had, which was a 20,000 mile Alfasud TI Green Cloverleaf, a silver one, which was Y-Reg and went by the nickname of Wobbly because first 3 letters of its number plate were WBL, and it was a Y-Reg. And that was a great car. I had that for about 5 years, something like that, 4 years. Did quite a few miles in it. And that really, it wasn't as fast as some of its contemporaries in a straight line, like a Golf GTI or even an XR 2i or 3i, but boy, was it fast around the corners. And Alfasuds are legendary in the handling stakes for a very good reason, because the design of them is just fantastic for road holding. And there's many the smile that came onto my face just by braking not at all through a series of roundabouts and making rapid progress down the road, commuting to work back in the late 80s. It was just such a great car to drive, such good fun and very fond memories. So yeah, that was the last Sud I had. And I suppose that I'd got rid of the Berliner by then. In 1990, so whilst I had the Silver Sud, I bought a Dutch blue, 1973 Julia Super 1600 from a club member called John Norbury, who lived in Hertford. He and his wife both ran Alfas. His actually was a blue 1600 GT Junior, and the Super was his wife Enid's car. So when they decided they were going to sell one, I bought that. And I had some work done to it. There were a few things that needed tidying up. And that has been with me ever since, and I still have it over 30 years on. So it's been a second car most of the time, or tucked up in the garage as a High Days, Holidays and Alfa Club show car. But from time to time, when my main car went wrong, or we had sold and we were looking for another one, it was pressed into service. When our son Gabriel was born, my wife Fran used to drive him around in it to toddler groups or to nursery school for a while. And so that has got we've got quite an affection for that car in the family. And that's why it's still here when so many of the others have come and gone.
And there's a couple of others that you've had for a while, aren't there?
Yes, I suppose it depends what you mean by had for a while.
Well, I think until the 5-year Alfasud ownership, we were averaging about a year a car. So
yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right. They were a year to 2 years per car. Some of them overlapped a bit.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think what the next one was. I dallied with a number of cars in the early 90s. I bought a couple of Alfa 75s. So I had a couple of Alfa 75 1.8s, which I used as road cars. And I really liked those, actually. Nice revvy engine and great handling. And I had a left-hand drive 1.6, a French car, which was great as well, which a friend asked me if I'd sell it to him, and I said yes, of course. I had a 75 Twin Spark, which I bought needing a couple of jobs done, including a rear wheel bearing, I remember, and sold that for a profit. And I bought and sold several of these cars just casually. I bought them as my road car, did some work and sold them, made a little bit of money to pay for racing that I'd started in the 90s. I had a couple of 3-litre 75s, which were absolutely awesome. Anyone who's had a Busso V6 engine car knows exactly what I'm talking about. Off a roundabout, booting a 75, it would adopt a fantastic angle up the road, and you'd be turning into it as you went straight along the road, but at an angle. And of course, just the sound of the motor was fantastic. So I'm just trying to think what else I had. In fact, the newest Alfa I have had was a 145 green cloverleaf, which was about a 97 car. And to give you an idea of when that was, I had that before my son Gabriel was born, and he's nearly 19. So it was relatively new at the time. And again, I bought it in East London it was missing one of its gears. It was making some funny noises, but it was very cheap. It clearly needed some attention, but I took it to A.D. Hawkins at AH Motorsports, and he's a very competent chap. He looked over it, fixed it all, gave me the bill, and I ended up with a really nice 145 cloverleaf for not too much cash. And I thought, fantastic, here we go. We've got a car that'll be absolutely fine for Fran to run around taking the new arrival around. But of course, what you don't realise is that with cars like that, you've got to lift babies into the back seat. You've got to slide the seat forward, lean over, and lift this hefty baby in the car seat into the back. And I'd say probably within about 2 or 3 weeks of having Gabriel, Fran's back had gone from trying to lift him into the back. So I had to take over the lifting, and then I started getting a bad back from lifting him into the car. And we had to get rid of the car. We swapped it for a 5-door Fiat at the time, moving away from Alfa, which was sad. But again, a good friend of mine said, "Oh, can I buy it?" And it disappeared very quickly. I didn't even need to advertise it. So that was the most recent Alfa I've had, the newest one. But of course, I've had Alfas the whole of the intervening time, the blue Super that I mentioned. And you said I have some others. I do. I have an old original right-hand drive UK delivered Julia 1600 Ti, which is a lovely moss green colour. And there was a little bit of a story about finding that and actually managing to acquire it. So Fran's family live in Scotland, and we were visiting them. And I saw on Auto Trader, because I just couldn't resist flicking through Auto Trader while I was up there, I saw actually really for 2004 a relatively rare ad for a 105 series car in Auto Trader, and it said, Julia Saloon and 1964. I thought 1964. Well, there really are no early Julia Saloons in this country. There are a handful of original right-hand drives that are actually going. And I persuaded my in-laws that it would be great to drive from between Glasgow and Edinburgh all the way down to the Ayrshire coast for a lovely day out at the seaside, so I could slip off and have a look at this Julia TI, which I did. And I didn't pull the wool over their eyes. They knew what I was up to. But while they went off and enjoyed the views on the coastline, I met up with a guy who ran a garage in Girvan on the Ayrshire coast. Very nice man. And he said, yes, I also have a farm up in the hills, and the car is currently in the barn up there. So we jumped in his car, and we went up through about 6 or 7 gates that he had to get out and open and then shut behind him, up to the farmhouse, which was an old stone place with a huge stone barn with 3 arches in the front. And I could feel the excitement of waiting. The hairs went up on the back of my neck. I knew that this old car was going to be in the barn. And we walked up to the door on the far left and in. And it was a little bit dark in there, but some light was spilling through on the far end, and I could see a shape under sheets. And it was unmistakable, that 3-box Julia Saloon shape. And we went up, he pulled the sheets off, and it was amazing. There was a car there that was really so original. It was amazing. It looked as though it had its original paint. I mean, to be fair, the tyres looked like they were probably from the 1960s. And it was just...
Which is less desirable than original paint.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, there was another story there. I mean, the tyres were quite wooden. But to cut a long story short, I looked round it and I just knew that I had to buy it. These opportunities don't come up very often, especially when it's something that you really appreciate and would like to have. So I thought, well, I'd try negotiating with him. But he said, young man, he said, I know you've come from London. And, I knew that meant really that there was no way I was going to negotiate. So I said, okay, I will buy it. And so I paid him the money he was asking. And that was the first time in my life, and probably just about the only time I've ever seen £100 notes, because he wanted cash, obviously. And I had to go to the bank in Glasgow and get the money in cash, and it came in hundreds. So I had 60 £100 notes, paid £6,000 for the car. And, it was a lot of money at the time. And I thought, am I doing the right thing? Because you never know. The values of those cars at that time were not as high as they are now. And I thought, well, maybe I'm paying over the odds. But I still thought it's so original. And I know that I can conserve it and look after it. And it will be a nice thing to be able to bring out into the open. And so that's what I did. And he did say that he'd bought it from the original owner, and he'd seen it in a garage in Ayrshire in the 60s when he was a young mechanic there. So he'd known the car from when it was new. And when it came up for sale, I think probably when it was around 10 years old, something like that, maybe a little bit more, he bought it for his wife. But of course, it turned out she didn't really like it that much. And so it sat in the showroom of his garage for many years, apparently, and hadn't been more than 10 miles from Girvan for probably, 25 years, something like that, when I bought it. And the collecting of it was interesting. I thought, well, I've got no tools with me. I've got no backup except Fran and Gabriel. So I need to be prepared. I went to Alfasuds. I bought oil. I bought a fuel can, I bought a zippy case of tools, a tow rope, some jump leads, some WD-40, and probably some other things I can't remember. Brake fluid, I think I bought. Got as many things as I reasonably could. And on our way back from seeing the in-laws, we diverted via Ayrshire to the garage where the car was, ready and waiting. And off I drove, waved goodbye to the nice garage man, and off I went. This was October 2004, so it wasn't cold, but it was cool. We left Ayrshire and drove down to the M74, and onwards, and that takes you down towards the border with England. And I realised once the car was at speed that there was no heat coming out of the heater. And the temperature dropped a little bit as the day went on. And actually, you know why people in vintage cars have got thick blankets wrapped around their legs, because it is really cold in cars with all that wind chill on them, and it does transfer through to the inside. But anyway, the car was humming along perfectly at about 50 to 55 miles an hour. I had fuel, the oil pressure was holding up, temperature was good. And I thought, yes, we're going to do it. We cruised down past Gretna Green into England and carried on. And then it started getting darker, and I turned the side lights on. And when I did so, the battery light on the dash just glowed faintly. And I thought, the dynamo is obviously marginal on charging the battery. A bit later, it was darker still, and I flipped it onto dip beam, and then the light was coming through even more brightly. And I thought, oh no, I hope the battery's charged up well, because this isn't looking good. And then it got fully dark, and I was thinking things couldn't get any worse for the battery, and then it started raining, and so I was flipping the wipers on, and every time I put the wipers on, suddenly the light on the dash became incredibly bright, and I knew things were getting very bad when all the dash lights started flickering, and we were down between Manchester and Birmingham somewhere, and I could see I saw a sign for services, and I knew that I just had to pull in at the next services. So pulled in, parked up and turned it off, and I turned the key. I knew what was going to happen. Nothing. So called the AA, and the AA man came after about an hour, and he said, oh, we'll have you going again. And we popped the bonnet, and he got his big starter pack out, put the huge clamps fishing around in the engine bay, but I don't know exactly what he did, but he shorted the voltage regulator, and there was a massive blue flame and a smell of burning. And then he said, I think I'm going to have to call for recovery. And we certainly weren't driving anywhere else that day. But that was the end of the story, essentially. Got it towed home and tucked away in the garage. And subsequently, that car was brought back to life with the help of a very good guy in Suffolk, Titus Rowlandson at Victory Garage, who's a great guy to use if you want to conserve a car. And so he stripped and cleaned everything, and we only replaced the bits that really needed replacing. So yes, of course, it had a new set of historic Pirelli Cinceratos, and it had some rubber bits like brake hoses for safety and some of the other hoses. But nearly everything on it is as it was when I picked it up, and the only paint it's ever had in its life is a little bit along the sills, which the previous owner said was done in the late 70s. So it's a lovely original car with about 37,000 miles on the clock, which currently is tucked up under sheets in my garage, waiting for the next outing next year, hopefully.
And it's not on its own in the garage, is it?
No, it's not. In that it sits, I've got a little workshop, so it sits at the back of the workshop. And the reason I can't take it out at the moment is that there's a car in front of it. And that is a left-hand drive Giulia saloon, a Giulia 1600 Super from 1972. And that was a historic rally car. I saw it for sale on eBay in 2012. And I looked at it, and I watched it in my eBay list, and I thought, oh, look at that. It hasn't bid up very high. I'm sure it's going to go quite a lot higher. So I picked a number which I thought, I'd be happy to buy it for that. And I'm sure someone's going to pay a lot more. And with about 10 seconds to go, I placed the bid. I hadn't seen the car, didn't know anything about it. I hadn't mentioned it to Fran. And of course, you get that little sort of thing on the screen that's sort of going round and round while eBay is processing your bid. And then it popped up and said, congratulations, you're the winner. So I bought myself, sight unseen, a rally prepared Giulia Super, left-hand drive one. And how exciting that was. I called Titus and said, Titus, I bought a car. Could you pick it up and take it back to your place and just give it the once over? Because I need to know the things that are good about it and the things that need doing to it. So he did. He picked it up, took it back, had a look, and it turned out that it was very good indeed. It had lots of good bits on it, and a limited slip axle, a special one, a rebuilt gearbox, 45 Webers, and a special Alfaholic suspension, which hadn't been mentioned in the ad, and all sorts of other bits, as well as a cage as well. So it hadn't looked quite as nice as one would like in the ad, because it had been rallied with utility in mind, so it had Subaru Impreza seats in it. So I quickly swapped those out for some Ridgard leather rally seats, which are fantastic looking and suit the period of the car. And Titus was talking to me about the engine. He said, this is a monster of an engine. It turned out that the engine had been built by Dave Hood for a guy who was racing a GT-AM and had gone so fast up a mountain in France somewhere that he'd gone straight off the edge and wrecked the car. And the engine was about the only salvageable bit. And even then, I believe it needed some work. But Dave acquired it to put in a racing GTA in the UK. But I believe that never really happened. And so it was sold to the guy who had been building this Giulia Super Rally car. And I inherited it with all sorts of interesting modifications, including very large inlet ports with slide-in reducers, which I think were some sort of Auto Delta mod for racing at some point. So I'm sure someone out there knows more about them than I do. So yeah, we got that car back together, but we didn't put the monster engine in it. We used my Group N spec engine from the Alfa Championship of the 90s, which I still had, and with a few modifications, so different pistons and a ported head. And that's the engine in the car at the moment. And it goes exceptionally well, about 165 brake horsepower, handles very flat, makes a very good noise. And I've used that as my show attendance car for the last 2 or 3 years. And it's always an occasion to take that car out on the road. It's a little bit too bumpy, it's a little bit too noisy, but it's always good fun.
Is that the complete collection at the moment?
It nearly is, because I still have the race car that I've had for 30 years. And I do have another GT Junior tucked up against a rainy day in a hidden location, which may come out at some time. But that would need a lot more work than I'm prepared to do right at this moment.
I just wanted to end this episode looking back on your role at Southern Alfa Day this year, which I think most people would agree was an amazing event under the circumstances, indeed under any circumstances.
Well, I mean, you're intimately involved yourself here, Guy, because, of course, you are a member of the Thames Valley section and involved with the committee, so you know about the organisation that's been required. But yes, this year has been very difficult for the club, hasn't it? We've not been able to run the great events that we normally run, and so there's been an appetite for an event, or any event, that people could travel to more widely. And we were very lucky, I think, to be able to hook up with a great venue in Oxfordshire, Stoner Park, which is a very historic family home and deer park just near Henley-on-Thames. And because it's a private park, it's not open to the general public just to wander about. It has been possible for them to implement quite strict COVID-19 measures, and in conversation with them they said yes, we could run a car event for you. They're well acquainted with doing that. They've run the VW National Day for many years and had events from the Bentley Drivers Club to Ferraris, and they run a regular supercar Sundays as well, so it is something they know about. But clearly it was going to be a challenge with the need for social distancing at the current time. But they had a good safety measures plan approved by the local environmental health officers at South Oxfordshire District Council and also by Thames Valley Police. And so we could see that there was a good chance we could run the event as long as national guidelines allowed it. And so we set it up, promoted it, and then just with a week or so to go before the event, which was the 19th of September, a new announcement, the Rule of Six, came out, which threw all the plans awry because we weren't sure whether that was going to affect the event. As it turned out, the safety measures for the event allowed it to go ahead on Saturday the 19th, which was, as we speak, last Saturday, and it went exceptionally well. It was a beautiful day. The temperature was about 23, 24 degrees with blue skies, and I think we had about 380 Alfas and just under 800 people. So that makes it the largest Southern Alfa Day that we've had, and it was a great success. The location within the park is very picturesque. It's a natural bowl, so the cars were ranged upon the slopes close to the house, which made for fantastic photo opportunities, and the cars were arranged in model parking, so there were some lovely older cars, 750 and 101 series Giuliettas, parked near to the house, to Stoner House, and it went exceptionally well. Everybody I spoke to thoroughly enjoyed themselves and hope that we can go back there again in the future.
Yeah, I mean, despite being a member of the committee, I had almost no involvement in organising the event, bar parking my 939 Spider at the end of the Spider and Brera line and allowing people to park next to it. But I don't think I've ever been to an event like that, a National Alpha Day or a Southern Alpha Day, and not had at least one moan from somebody about something. I'm sure part of that was the pent-up demand and not having been to an event, but everybody was just so enthusiastic and so complimentary about the whole thing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think you're right. There was a pent-up demand, and probably people hadn't had anything else to compare it to either this year. So it stood out as a sort of memorable day, I hope, for most people.
So yeah, I think one of the things that impressed me at Southern Alpha Day was the variety of cars and the number of cars that I haven't seen together for a long time. There's probably more 75s and more Suds than I've seen in 6 or 7 years at any Alpha event. What were the highlights for you?
Oh, there were a lot of nice cars. I was really delighted to see so many 750 and 101 Julias and Juliettas turn up. Some absolute beauties there, including an early Sprint that had been pulled out of a barn somewhere. It had Lebanese plates on it originally, and it had been restored to perfection. An absolute beauty. There was also an SS, a red SS that turned up not for very long, unfortunately. I didn't get a chance to look very closely, but the design of those cars is absolutely fantastic. The highlight for me, I think, probably was John Dooley's Alfasud TI, which was parked in pride of place at the top of the drive. And what a historic racing car. John drove that little car to third place, I think, in the 1981 British Saloon Car Championship. And it was absolutely brilliant to see it at Southern Alpha Day. It was a fitting tribute to John, and I'm sure he would have been delighted that it was there. And it got so much attention, Guy, during the day. People taking photos of it with the backdrop of the house and the other cars. It was marvellous to see. And I should mention Chris Whelan, who is the current owner. He acquired the car from John, and it was in pretty dreadful condition, having been stored in one of John's barns for many years. But he spent a lot of time and resources on getting it back together and restoring it to a fantastic state. And the best thing of all is that he actually still races it. So the actual car that came third in 1981 is still used in historic racing, and I think that's marvellous.
Well, and talking to Chris, I think it's nice to know that John got to see it in its restored state shortly before he died, which is fantastic. The one thing that I wasn't aware of, I'd seen lots of stories about how John was campaigning the 90,000 mile 5 or 6 year old company car that he'd driven at Alfa Romeo GB. What I hadn't realised was that when that car finally expired, it was replaced by the car that Chris has got now, which I believe was his wife Meg's shopping car. So the heritage of both those cars is just incredible.
It is. John was an amazing guy, and he contributed a lot to the club, both in the running of the club, making the club or helping the club move forward, and in particular in the racing side through his own exploits and encouraging others. I know when I started, John was there. I raced. I turned out in races with John, and he was very supportive. And he was just the sort of guy that you needed to give you advice when you were starting out. A great encouragement to know that you're talking to someone who has done so much racing and achieved so much.
That's all we've got time for this week, but join us again in 2 weeks' time when we'll pick up the conversation and talk about Jonathan's racing career and his role on the board. As usual, episode 16 will be available from Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, and all good sources of podcasts from 1:30 on October the 11th. So until then, stay safe.